Alex, anytime you want to start.
All right. Well, any more joining us? No. Okay. Well, first of all, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Cliff Goldfarb. In addition to being a member of the Sims board, he's one of the top estates and trust lawyers, as some of you I'm sure know. Cliff has also published on numerous subjects, both legal and otherwise, but his favorite, of course, is Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. He was able to worship at the shrine at 221B Baker Street when in the early 70s he did his graduate degree in law at the London School of Economics. He even found time to work with me on a film on the city of David in Jerusalem back in 1983. So you can see he's a man of many talents. But my greatest pleasure is, of course, being able to call Cliff a good friend for much of the past half century. So without further ado, let me introduce Cliff Goldfarb on Arthur Conan Doyle and the Egyptian Connection. All yours, Cliff.
Thank you very much, Alex. Welcome to everybody. Many years ago, before I had ever given a talk to the Institute, Alex jokingly told me that there was no connection between Sherlock Holmes and the Mediterranean. So I set out to prove otherwise. And this is, I think, my third talk. And although there's not a huge connection with Sherlock Holmes, there's a much larger connection with Arthur Conan Doyle, which I hope to demonstrate tonight. So my talk today has no remarkable new discovery to announce, nor does it have a thesis to propose. It simply has a theme. I'm just going to talk about Arthur Conan Doyle and Egypt. That is, Arthur Conan Doyle in Egypt, Arthur Conan Doyle writing about Egypt, his works with an Egyptian element, and things in Arthur Conan Doyle's life and career that are connected to Egypt. This will include, but not be limited to, some or all of Napoleonic connections, Lord Kitchener and the Battle of Omdurman, dervishes, camels, Nile cruises, foreign correspondence, undead mummies and their curses, excuse me, Coptic monasteries, archaeology and colonialism, and a Toronto Egyptian connection. There's a great deal of material to cover in this talk, and unfortunately will only be possible in most cases to give you a taste. The full story is best told by Conan Doyle in his own words, which he has done in 3 of his books. Conan Doyle was clearly fascinated by Egypt. He devoted 2 of the 32 chapters of his 1924 autobiography, Memories and Adventures, to one single winter there, as well as the better parts of chapters in 2 of his spiritualist campaign travel books, Wanderings of a Spiritualist and Our African Winter, to his 2 subsequent short visits. Egypt clearly highly impressed a man who had a life full of adventures and a huge experience of the world. Let's talk a little bit about his biography. For those of you who are familiar with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle only as the creator of Sherlock Holmes, possibly the most famous literary character of all time, let me take a few minutes to tell you more about this remarkable man and his accomplishments. Arthur Aloysius Conan Doyle was born in Edinburgh on May 22, 1859. His father, Charles Altamont Doyle, was a failed architectural draftsman and artist who eventually had to be institutionalized for alcoholism and epilepsy. His grandfather, John Doyle, was a leading political cartoonist during the Duke of Wellington's political days. His uncle Richard, or Dickie Doyle, who illustrated some of Dickens' work and designed Mr. Punch, who graced the cover of Punch magazine, was a very well-known illustrator. His mother, Mary Foley, was a romantic who beguiled young Arthur with stories of his ancestors. Arthur attended Jesuit primary and secondary residential schools, including a final year at Feldkirch in Austria. It was there that he decided to renounce his Catholic faith. In 1875, he entered the University of Edinburgh Medical School, where he was a clerk for Dr. Joseph Bell, who was to be the model for Sherlock Holmes as a scientific detective. He twice served as a ship's doctor during his school years, once on a whaling ship north of Greenland when he was only 20 and still had a year of medical school to go, and the other right out of school on a cargo ship that sailed down the West African coast. He practiced family medicine in Portsmouth from 1883 to 1890, when he left to become an ophthalmologist in London. But when his Sherlock Holmes stories brought him fame and fortune, he gave up medical practice in 1891 to become a full-time doctor. He wrote on many different subjects. His fiction and nonfiction writing included historical fiction, science fiction, histories, poetry, books about the causes he took up, short stories about medicine, pirates, Roman times, and so many others. His popular novels, The White Company and The Lost World are the best known of his non-Sherlockian work. His pamphlet, The War in South Africa, Its Causes and Conduct, in defense of the behavior of British troops, won him a knighthood. The Crime of the Congo led directly to the reform of the Belgian administration of the Congo. He was a fine multi-sport athlete, stood twice for Parliament but lost, and became Britain's greatest advocate for the spiritualist movement. Two of his books were instrumental in overturning wrongful convictions. But all of his achievements and
sales event.
Sorry, please mute. But all of his achievements and literary accomplishments pale in the face of the Sherlock Holmes stories. 4 novels and 56 short stories. He always felt obscured his true calling for historical fiction. In fact, he did try to kill Holmes off in The Final Problem, published in 1893, and didn't bring him back until 1901, when The Hound of the Baskervilles was published. His publisher agreed to double his payment when Conan Doyle offered to add Holmes as a character. After that, he would roll out Sherlock Holmes stories from time to time until 1927. He died on July 7, 1930. We live in a world in which academia largely presents history to us through a so-called progressive or post-colonial narrative, under which colonialism is an evil thing perpetrated by Europeans whose descendants are held responsible for all of its evils, and virtually all others are victims of racism. The reality is, at least in my opinion, different. It is not rationally possible to defend or to justify every aspect of colonialism, but it cannot be denied that it had its positive aspects. Conan Doyle did defend what he saw as colonialism's positive aspects. For this time, he would have been considered progressive and enlightened in the old-fashioned sense, even though some of the things he said or wrote would be held against him today. I won't be focusing on that in this talk, though I will occasionally refer to his views. Incidentally, what you're looking at is the Jubilee stamp of Queen Victoria in 1898, showing in red the British Empire, to give you an idea of just how much of the world was under British control at that time. So Conan Doyle was in Egypt on 3 separate occasions. Only one of them was a lengthy stay. In November 1895, he took his first wife, Louise, affectionately known as Tui, to Egypt, hoping that the warm, dry climate would help to fight the tuberculosis she had been diagnosed with in 1893. They returned to England at the end of April 1896. His 1924 autobiography, Memories and Adventures, contains wonderful descriptions of the sights and people he met on the way. I'll speak about the second and third trips in 1921 and 1929 a bit later. I want to start by putting Egypt into a political perspective as it existed in 1895 and then 1921. In 1895, Egypt was not officially a part of the British Empire. For many centuries, it had been ruled by the Mamluk military caste. In 1517, the Mamluks lost control to the Ottoman Turks, and Egypt was a semi-autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire from 1517 to 1867. Napoleon Bonaparte's French forces invaded in 1798. Anglo-Turkish forces expelled the French in 1801. In 1805, Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Albanian military commander of the Ottoman army in Egypt, seized power and de facto established the Khedivate of Egypt, becoming the first Khedive. In 1882, British forces supporting Khedive Tewfik invaded and occupied Egypt and restored stability for the benefit of British and French financial interests in the Suez Canal. Egypt and Sudan remained nominally as Ottoman provinces until 1914, when the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers of World War I, resulting in their official annexation together with Cyprus. By the time Conan Doyle traveled back and forth through the Suez Canal in 1920 and 21, the UK had formally occupied Egypt in the face of considerable unrest. In response, the UK unilaterally declared Egyptian independence on February 28, 1922, but remained control of the Canal Zone, Sudan, and Egypt's external protection of foreigners and separate courts for foreigners, the police forces, the army, the railways, and the communications. British troops were stationed in cities and towns. When Conan Doyle briefly visited Cairo in 1929, British troops were stationed, at the citadel built by the great ruler Saladin in the 12th century. Britain retained control of the Canal Zone until 1947. So although it was not part of the British Empire when Conan Doyle arrived in the winter of 1895, and again in 1921 and 1929, to all intents and purposes, he was in British territory, just as much as he would have been in India. In Cairo in 1895 and 6, Arthur and Toohey stayed at the Mina House Hotel. He found time to engage in many activities. He wrote, "I ascended the Great Pyramid once and was certainly never tempted to do so again, and was content to watch the struggles of the endless drive of tourists who attempted that uncomfortable and useless feat." In March 1896, he made a private trip to the Salt Lakes in the desert, 50 miles west of Cairo, visiting an isolated monastery in which many of the monks seemed to him to be leading lives of idleness debauched by wine. Because most of the available transportation had been requisitioned by the military, part of the trip had to be made in a very unsuitable coach of state, which had been built for Napoleon III on the chance that he would come for the opening of the Suez Canal. The emperor did not come. I haven't been able to determine from numerous sources which of these two carriages was the one he traveled in. Either one across the desert with no roads would not be a comfortable proposition. Here's a copy of the New Year's card that he sent to friends. His friend Jerome K. Jerome ended up publishing it. Note the reference to golf. There really was and still is a golf course at the Mina House Hotel within sight of the pyramids, but a plaque at the hotel says it was established in 1899. Conan Doyle probably just hit golf balls in an empty field, much as he and Rudyard Kipling had done in Vermont Farmers Field during Conan Doyle's 1894 tour of the US and Canada. He wrote a letter to a young friend, Douglas Ainsley, inviting him to take a short trip to Jerusalem. Ainsley, a British diplomat, theater critic, and humorist, was also staying at the Mina House and apparently went riding around the area with Conan Doyle. As far as we know, the trip never took place. Conan Doyle likely refers to Ainsley in the short story A Pot of Caviar, set during the Boxer Rebellion in China. One of the people trapped in the siege was young Ainsley of the diplomatic service. Why Conan Doyle never managed to visit Jerusalem is a mystery. He was in the region at least 4 times, and a return trip could have been made in less than a week. Certainly it was a visit he would have very much wanted to make. The question, when does the century start? In a letter on Mina House stationery to Herbert Greenough Smith, his editor at the Strand magazine, Conan Doyle gets it wrong. "I shall adhere to my statement The middle day of the century is January 1st, 1850. The century ends with December 31, 1899. When the first installment of Rodney's Stone appeared in the January 1896 issue of the Strand magazine, the opening words were, "On this, the first day of January in the year 1850, the 19th century has reached its midway term." When the story appeared in book form and in all subsequent editions, the date was corrected to 1851. This letter is now in the Arthur Conan Doyle collection here in Toronto. With his wife Tui, he traveled up the Nile on the paddle steamer Nitocris, right here, as far as the Wadi Halfa, near the second cataract of the Nile, a day's voyage south of Aswan. The boat was possibly chartered by Conan Doyle for his party. Although boat passengers were safe at that time, anyone traveling by land was risking attack by Bedouin camel raiders, whom Europeans called dervishes. They visited a village which had recently been attacked and met some of the wounded survivors. Conan Doyle's uneasiness at being separated from their tour guide gave him the idea for a novella, The Tragedy of the Carrasco, which starts with a description of a similar steamer tour. However, the tourists in Carrasco are captured by dervishes and subjected to great hardships in the desert until the few survivors are finally rescued by the local British garrison. In his introduction to the 1930 Crowborough edition of his works, he wrote, "The tragedy of the Carrasco is meant to show the effect upon the character of a varied group of people when they are suddenly plunged into frightful disaster." Carrasco was adapted into a play, The Fires of Fate, in 1909. There were substantial changes to the plot, with a quite different point of view, although the key elements didn't change. The play starred Lewis Waller, who also played Brigadier Gerard in Conan Doyle's Brigadier Gerard play and movie. The play had a modestly successful run in the UK and in New York, and it was made into a film called The Desert Sheik in 1924. Additional remakes of the film appeared in 1932 and in a French version in 1948. Douglas Carr wrote that both the novella and the play contain plenty of contemporary Orientalists and racist tropes. He suggests that Conan Doyle was perhaps influenced by the press reports of the death of General Gordon at the hands of the Mahdi in Khartoum in 1885. Conan Doyle describes a typical Mahdist soldier as a desperate fanatic who rushes to death with the frenzy of a madman and longs for close quarters where he can bury his spear in the body of his foeman, even though he carries several bullets in him before he reaches him. The play was the subject of the 2023 Cameron Hollier Memorial Lecture of the Friends of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection here in Toronto by Dana Richards, which you can watch on the YouTube channel of the Friends. And Richards explained that the book was in part propaganda for the British role of protector of the weaker races around the world, weaker in quotes. The play was a morality play, showing how in the end the horrors of being kidnapped and threatened with death, if they did not convert to Islam, strengthened the hostages' characters. It also was deeply concerned with resisting the urge to commit suicide and standing true to one's belief. One is rewarded not only by honor, but with deliverance from death. When Conan Doyle learned of General Kitchener's upcoming campaign against the Khalifa at Khartoum, he decided, clearly I must go up by hook or by crook to the frontier. He obtained credentials as a special correspondent for the Westminster Gazette and traveled up the Nile to Aswan with a group of British officers. There he met professional correspondents coming from Britain. They bought camels at the local camel souk or market and set off for the front at Saris, just over the modern border with Sudan, riding in the early hours of the morning to avoid the heat. That's actually a picture of Conan Doyle. It's not a photograph, but it's probably fairly accurate, appearance. Kitchener invited Conan Doyle to dine and assured him that nothing could happen for some time, as the army had to collect several thousand camels to prepare for the campaign. Reluctantly, Conan Doyle returned by boat to Cairo in late April, having got a whiff of real war in the little fortress, but no sign of advance. He published 8 articles in the Gazette from the trip, and from the adventure came a story to 3 correspondents about rivals who compete with each other through the hardships of the desert to be the first to return with the news. On September 2, 1898, young Winston Churchill, who was a correspondent attached to the British force that finally made it to Omdurman, where he took in an active part in the last British cavalry charge of the 19th century. 2 years later, in 1900, he and Conan Doyle met just after returning from the Boer War and became friends. Like Conan Doyle, Churchill wrote about the Sudan campaign, producing the River War in 1898. Conan Doyle also took his second wife, Jean, and his 3 younger children on a spiritualist campaign to Australia and New Zealand, sailing south through the Suez Canal on the SS Naldera, arriving at Port Said sometime after August 19, 1920, and in the Red Sea by August 24. They passed through the canal again on the return trip sometime in the second week of March 1921. He wrote extensively about the voyage in Wanderings of a Spiritualist. The return trip was just weeks before the Cairo conference, in which Winston Churchill and other British officials made the decisions which settled much of today's geographic and political boundaries of Mesopotamia and Palestine. That's Churchill. I believe that's Lawrence of Arabia, and somewhere in there, I think that's Gertrude Bell, famous British diplomats. Here's Conan Doyle's comment about some of the evils of colonialism. Port Said came at last, and we entered the Suez Canal. It is a shocking thing that the entrance to this, one of the most magnificent of the works of man, are flanked by great sky advertisements of various brands of whiskey. The sale of whiskey may or may not be a tolerable thing, but by its flaunting advertisements, DeWar, Johnny Walker, and the rest have surely long been intolerable. What the abstemious Mohammedan can think is beyond my imagination. In that direction, at least, the religion of Muhammad is done better than that of Christ. If all those Eskimos, South Sea Islanders, and others who have been converted to Christianity and then debauched by drink had followed the prophet instead, it cannot be denied that their development would have been a happier and a higher one. Wherever he traveled, he observed the local culture and peoples and was not timid in expressing his opinions. As much as he was an ardent supporter of the empire, he was also acute enough to know that there would come a time when it would be in the best interests of all for some of the territories which had achieved sufficient maturity to become independent. He wrote, "So long as the canal is secure and it is no one's interest to injure it, we should be better if the country governed itself. We have too many commitments, and if we have to take new ones, such as Mesopotamia, it would be well to get rid of some of the others where our task is reasonably complete. We never yet let the youngsters grow up," said a friendly critic. The reference to Mesopotamia or modern-day Iraq shows he was aware of the issues which would soon be the subject of the Cairo conference. Conan Doyle had a lifelong fascination with the exodus of the Hebrew slaves from Egypt, their miraculous escape from Pharaoh's pursuing army, and their desert wanderings. This appears as a theme in his earliest writing. At Stonyhurst Jesuit School in 1874, aged 15, he was assigned the task of writing a poem on the crossing of the Red Sea by the Israelites. His effort concluded, "There was no time for thought and none for fear, for Egypt's horse already pressed their rear down to their climax. One horrid cry, the tragedy was o'er, and Pharaoh with his army was seen no more." He returned to the book of Exodus in describing his southward trip through the Suez Canal in 1920. "In the evening, we were through the canal and marked the rugged shore upon our left. down which the Israelites pursued their way in the direction of Sinai. One wonders how much truth there is in the narrative. On the one hand, it is impossible to doubt that something of the sort did occur. On the other, the impossibility of so huge a crowd living on the rare wells of the desert is manifest. But numbers are not the strong point of an Oriental historian. Perhaps 1,000 or two may have followed their great leader upon that perilous journey. Modern archaeologists have come to a similar conclusion. His third trip was another family affair. From November 1928 to April 1929, a spiritualist campaign with major stops in South Africa and Kenya, returning via the P&O liner Modassa. They arrived at Port Sudan on March 24, 1929, and the Conan Doyle family made a trip by train to Suakim in Sudan. The ship arrived at Suez on March 29, and Conan Doyle's party disembarked for a very busy one-day visit to Egypt, traveling by car to Cairo. He wrote, "It is amazing how this city has progressed. Everywhere as we traversed it, I saw signs of growth and opulence, which make it the worthy capital of a nation. I knew the place well in 1896, and yet there is much of it which I could not have recognized, so great are the improvements." His family visited the pyramids and the Sphinx, then returned to Cairo to visit the Egyptian Museum to see the mummy of King Tut and the relics from his tomb. A rather weak and kindly face the young man had. How strange that after nearly 40 centuries we know more about his menage than that of any monarch in history. It was certainly sumptuous. I cannot suppose that for artistic design and coloring and the skillful fitting of precious stones and metals, we could equal the wonders that we saw. If these were the trappings of royalty, and if the nobles dressed to correspond, then the old court of Egypt must have been a wonder scene of magnificence. A visit to the mosque of Muhammad Ali followed, whom he described as a great soldier and a bloody-minded scoundrel who murdered the whole of his own bodyguards and who cut off the hands of the architect of the mosque that it might be his final work. After a British visit to the British command at the Citadel, where he was surprised to see that as a consequence of street assaults, against which a bayonet is a poor weapon, every soldier carried a life preserver, a wooden handle with a metal head slung on his belt. It was one of several proofs that under a calm surface, there were unseen currents. The final stop was a shopping trip to the bazaar. They traveled by train to Port Said, which was reached by 10 o'clock, rejoining their ship, which had just made the travel of the canal. I think that there have been a few days in our lives more full of impressions than that. So I want to talk about a number of his short stories that have Egyptian themes, including The Ring of Thoth, which was published in 1890. An Egyptian priest receives an elixir that grants eternal life. But before he can give it to his loved one, Alma, she dies and is mummified. He wants to die so that he can join her in the afterlife. The antidote is hidden in the Ring of Thoth, which the priest traces to the Louvre, where he is finally able to recover it and join Alma's mummy in death. The Mummy, a 1932 film starring Boris Karloff, bears a striking resemblance to the story. In lot number 249 is a Gothic horror story published in 1892 and tells of a University of Oxford Egyptology student, Edward Bellingham, who has brought back to life a mummy which attacks his enemies. One of them, the athlete Abercrombie Smith, escapes and forces Bellingham at gunpoint to destroy the mummy. Written during a period of great European interest in Egyptian culture, known as Egyptomania, lot number 249 was inspired by Conan Doyle's interests in the supernatural, crime, and Egyptology. Though reanimated mummies had previously appeared in English literature, Conan Doyle's story was the first to portray one as dangerous. This story has had a significant influence on subsequent fiction, and a new production of the story, adapted and directed by Mark Gatiss of the BBC's Sherlock series, was shown on BBC Two this past Christmas Eve. These two stories were written before his Egyptian winter and so cannot have been inspired by it. Well, it's time for Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle had killed Sherlock Holmes off in The Final Problem, published in 1893. He brought Holmes back in The Empty House, published in 1903, but set in 1894. Holmes accounts for the time when he was ostensibly dead, including a short but interesting visit to the Khalifa at Khartoum, the results of which I have communicated to the Foreign Office. Khartoum in the Sudan had been leveled by the Mahdi in 1885. 6 months later, the Mahdi was dead of typhus, and his successor, the Khalifa, was in Omdurman, which was more likely where Holmes should have gone. Conan Doyle was usually very careful in his historical references, so this was possibly a mistake on his part. Or maybe Conan Doyle just preferred the alliterative Khalifa at Khartoum over the Khalifa at Omdurman. Holmes's communication with the Foreign Office would have been through Sir Evelyn Baring, the British proconsul for Egypt, the man who would plan Kitchener's expedition to retake the Sudan. Of course, this story was set a few years before Conan Doyle's own attempt to become a war correspondent in Kitchener's campaign to avenge the death of General Gordon. Now I want to look at Conan Doyle's Egyptian connections to his Napoleonic work. These form a significant part of his writings and were produced over a span of 19 years. Conan Doyle was a great admirer of Napoleon. By 1895, he had read numerous accounts of his campaigns, including the invasion of Egypt, smashing the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids in July of 1798. There's a spoiler alert. If you have not yet seen Ridley Scott's film Napoleon, don't believe what he shows about the Battle of the Pyramids. It didn't happen. He wrote in his memoirs, these are the Brigadier Gerard stories. I was still doing the Brigadier Gerard stories while I was in Cairo, which required a good deal of historical research. But I had brought my materials with me, and all I lacked was the energy, which I found it most difficult to find in that enervating land. However, his memory on this 28 years later was faulty, since all but one of the first group of Gerard stories had already appeared in the Strand by September 1895. He did write part of the novel Uncle Bernac in Cairo that winter, the part that appeared in serial publication in 1896 and 1897. And when the novel appeared in book form in 1897, it had been padded out by about a third, after a lengthy digression on life in Napoleon's camp on the English Channel. Brigadier Gerard is an unmemorable secondary character in this novel. For those of you not familiar with Brigadier Gerard, I have to say that the 18 short stories about a dashing, hyper-confident, totally self-unaware aide to Napoleon, virtually the intellectual opposite of Sherlock Holmes, are the best of Conan Doyle's writing. Several of the tales have legitimate claim to be the best short stories of their time. Conan Doyle, wrote anywhere and anytime, under noisy conditions, and in the midst of his other daily adventures. Often he took inspiration from his surroundings or adventures, so it's another mystery to me why he did not set one of the Brigadier Gerard tales in Egypt. We can surmise that he might have used a plot he later created for one of the other Egyptian tales, such as the tragedy of the Korosko. True, as an author, he was so prolific and fertile that he might have come up with an original plot. But as Doyle scholars have always known, he frequently recycled his plots, clearly an early environmentalist among the writer of his generation. Imagine Brigadier Gerard on a mission to deliver an important message to Napoleon, riding a racing camel through areas controlled by hostile desert warriors. On November 26, 1922, Howard Carter, accompanied by his sponsor, the Earl of Carnarvon, opened the sealed doorway of the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. No intact pharaonic tomb had ever been found in Egypt. The find caused a frenzy, and even today a display of the magnificent finds from the tomb or new scholarly information about it is a headline occasion. Carnarvon had been in delicate health for many years. A minor mosquito bite on his cheek became infected, and he died. Thus sprang into existence the legend of the mummy's curse. The New York Times of April 6th carried the news of Carnarvon's death, just as Conan Doyle arrived in New York Harbor for a spiritualist speaking tour. He had no sooner stepped off the boat than he was confronted by a crowd of reporters who wanted to know what he thought about the mummy's curse. I think it is possible that some occult influence caused his death. There are many legends about the powers of the old Egyptians, and I know I wouldn't care to go fooling about their tombs and mummies. Of course, I don't say that some Egyptian spirit did kill Carnarvon, but I think it is possible. There are many malevolent spirits. There was a mummy in the British Museum which became noted because of the series of misfortunes which befell those who had anything to do with it. A friend of his, a British journalist, became very much interested in a tenacious curse. The journalist soon died of typhoid. Notably, 7 years later, Conan Doyle had no qualms about taking his wife and children to visit Tut and the relics of his tomb at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. There's an interesting Brigadier Gerard connection to Egypt and Toronto. A few years ago, Kai Yamamoto, who was then a University of Toronto graduate student in Egyptian archaeology, was studying a mud brick excavation hut at Abydos that Charles Trick Corelli, the founder of Toronto's Royal Ontario Museum, had used from fall 1902 to April 1903. On the floor of the hut, he found these fragments of a magazine cover. As a devotee of the Sherlock Holmes stories, Yamamoto recognized that this was an issue of the Strand magazine. He was able to reconstruct it as volume 25, number 147, published March 1903. For issue number 147, Conan Doyle's piece was The Adventures of Etienne Gerard, the Brigadier in England. When Yamamoto visited the Conan Doyle collection, he saw Sir Arthur's personal copy of the 1923 edition of The Life and Times of Akhenaten by Arthur Weigall. Weigall had excavated Abydos the year before Corelli. I asked about the possibility of getting this artifact with a Toronto connection for the Conan Doyle collection, but under Egyptian antiquities law being more than 100 years old, it was a non-starter. There are a number of novels and short stories by Conan Doyle which contain references to Egypt. None of them are essential to the plot, but 4 of them are Holmes tales. Sorry, that was the reconstructed cover. So here's some Egyptian references. In A Study in Scarlet, there's a reference to the Book of Mormon, as those sacred writings drawn in Egyptian letters on plates of beaten gold, which were handed unto the holy Joseph Smith at Palmyra. In the case of the golden pince nez, yes, sir, it is a crushing blow, said Professor Coram. That is my magnum opus, the pile of papers on the side table yonder. It is my analysis of the documents found in the Coptic monasteries of Syria and Egypt, a work which will cut deep at the very foundations of revealed religion. Conan Doyle was likely recalling his visit to the desert monastery. In the case of the retired colorman, published 23 years after the case of the golden pince nez, Holmes tells Watson that he's occupied with the case of the Coptic patriarchs. In his last bow, von Bork, the German spy, is showing his home to Baron von Herling, the German diplomat who kept papers on Egypt in his safe. A final story is The Jew's Breastplate, published in the Strand magazine for February 1899. It is the story of a theft from the Belmore Street Museum in London, in which the central hall, which contained a Jewish and Egyptian collection, were the finest of all its rooms. A thief has removed 12 precious stones from the breastplate of the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem and replaced them with cheap imitations. The retired curator who has recovered them from the thief wants to restore them without being detected. Each night he hides in a mummy case until the museum is empty. The new curator, Ward Mortimer, had lived 2 years in a tomb at Thebes while he excavated at the Valley of Kings. And finally, he had created a considerable sensation by the exhumation of the alleged mummy of Cleopatra in the inner room of the temple of Horus at Philae. And I just noted in the press the other day that they think they may have found the tomb of Cleopatra. So fiction results in history. A notable recent Sherlock Holmes pastiche, or short story about Sherlock Holmes written by someone else, is Nicholas Meyer's The Return of the Pharaoh, set in Egypt, in which Sherlock Holmes meets Howard Carter. The political climate is aptly described. The Ottoman Empire is crumbling. You might know Nicholas Meyer if you are familiar with his 1972 novel, The 7% Solution, which was turned into a very successful movie. So thank you very much. I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you very much, Cliff. That was absolutely fascinating. I want to acknowledge something which I should have mentioned at the very beginning, the co-sponsorship of tonight's lecture by the Toronto chapter of the Society for the Study of Egyptian Antiquities, and really pleased to see so many members of SSEA with us tonight. If you have a question, I ask you to click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen, and then put your question into the chat, and I'll see it and we'll read it out unless it works out. Yeah, let's try it that way. I'll start with one question, Cliff. You mentioned that Arthur Conan Doyle was that he rejected Catholic Christianity and that he was attached to spiritualism. Do we know anything about if he had any interest in ancient Egyptian religion, or whether his own religious beliefs might have been affected at all by his Egyptian experiences, or did his spiritualism come all before or later?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to what all of the influences are on spiritualism. He was deeply religious all his life. So he rejected the church as an establishment, but he maintained a belief in God. I think he maintained a belief in the basic principles of Christianity, as he refers to Christ on occasion. But he refers to, at one point, one of the people that he's contacted is an old spirit from some ancient civilization that comes through in seances and automatic writing and so on. So I'm not really sure what his influences were, but they were more in terms of life surviving death, and the dead being able to communicate in the afterlife to the people here on Earth through people who are properly attuned to be able to receive their communications. So I'm not so sure how much he was involved or believed in the religious beliefs of other religions or any, he was obviously a man of tremendous intellect, but he was in many ways deceived by these mediums that he would consult in the seances. So it's hard to say what all the influences were in his own political or his religious beliefs. But it's a great question. A lot of people have looked at it.
Somebody has a more general question. What exactly is meant by spiritualism?
I sort of said that.
A little bit, yes. Can you?
Yeah. It's a belief that after you die, your spirit survives in some form of afterlife, and that you can, through the proper methods of communication, communicate with people here on Earth. He thought it was an actual something like radio waves, and in fact, he tried to enlist Marconi in his efforts to see if they could use radio equipment to contact people in the afterlife and communicate with them. Marconi would have nothing to do with it.
While other people are writing questions, I have one here asking about Conan Doyle's economic status during his trips to Egypt, and the kinds of places that he stayed, and how that affected his travels. So looking at his economic status.
Well, once the Sherlock Holmes stories became popular, he was a doctor. Some people say that he was an unsuccessful doctor and had an unsuccessful medical practice. I don't think so. I think he was middle class for most of his medical practice up until 1890 when he quit and decided to write full time. But by that time, the money that was coming in from Sherlock Holmes elevated him into, I would say, the financial upper middle class, where he remained for the rest of his life. And he was able to maintain a fairly large establishment and afford to go anywhere he wanted to go in class. But in many ways, he had to keep writing, sort of like Churchill. He had to keep writing to support himself because his expenses were very high. And in Churchill's case, it was spent on wine and expensive houses and gambling and things like that. In Conan Doyle's case, he was supporting the spiritualist movement out of his own pocket in some ways. So he had to keep writing and earning good money from his writing. But he was very comfortable financially. He could afford to go first class.
You mentioned about supporting the spiritualist movement. There's another question here. You said earlier about how he went on a spiritualist campaign. What did he do on these occasions?
Well, he traveled mostly. He announced in 1917 that he would devote the rest of his life to the spiritualist cause, which was 13 years. And after that, and after the war ended, and after at the end of the war, his son and his brother both died in the great influenza epidemic at the end of the war. And it's not true. Some people think that he became a spiritualist after his son died, but in reality, he was flirting with spiritualist ideas from the 1880s, and just never really came out in public about until 1917. So after 1917, the bulk of his public activities were devoted to giving talks about spiritualism, to going to seances. He engaged in a seance here in the King Edward Hotel in Toronto on one of his visits. He did another one in Winnipeg, and he would try to find the best mediums of all times. He became friendly with Houdini, and Houdini was a skeptic about spiritualism, and the two of them became a very unusual pair of friends. And then they had a falling out in Atlantic City when Conan Doyle was in the United States giving talks about spiritualism. They had it's been written about, and it's made it to many mainstream newspapers as well as to the Conan Doyle world. Conan Doyle's wife, Jean, would do automatic writing. So she would go into a sort of a trance, and then the spirits would talk to her. And as they were talking to her, she would write down what they were saying. And Houdini wanted desperately to believe in spiritualism. So in this particular seance, they called up Houdini's mother and had, questions and answers. And Houdini sat through it very quietly and politely. And then he went away and said, "That wasn't my mother," for a number of reasons. One of which was his mother didn't speak English. Another one was that the Jean Conan Doyle started the writing by putting a cross at the top of the page. And Houdini said, "Well, my mother was Jewish, married to a rabbi, would never have done that." And then the final blow was that his mother was calling him Harry. So, "Well, my name is Eric Weiss, Erichweis. My mother would call me that, not Harry." So that clearly wasn't my mother. And because he kind of called Conan Doyle's wife into controversy, you didn't insult Conan Doyle's wife. Conan Doyle was the last of the British knights, of the Round Table. You didn't insult a woman, especially his wife, and that broke up their friendship. But Conan Doyle and Houdini were both parties to a contest that Scientific American launched in 1922 to find genuine evidences of communications with the spirits. And they would award $10,000 to anyone who could bring about a genuine spiritual activity that their panel of scientific experts could not show was not legitimate. And on a number of occasions, the panel was about to award the money when Houdini would say, "No, here's the trick they did," and how he would duplicate it or expose it. There's one famous one that I won't go into any detail, where he exposed a spirit named Marjorie that no one else could expose. And there's some thought that maybe he planted the evidence to expose her. But he always said, you know, he's both Conan Doyle and Houdini, they're famous. When Conan Doyle died, there was a memorial service from at the Royal Albert Hall, and his wife was sitting on the stage, and next to her was an empty chair, and next to that was a medium who claimed that Conan Doyle was in that empty chair. There's no other evidence of that. And Houdini's famous for having left a message with his wife saying, if I ever can get through to you, here's the secret phrase. If you know, you'll know that if you get this phrase, that it's me. And of course, all the years they did it, Bess, his wife, never heard that phrase. So from 1922 to virtually till 1929, or almost till his death, he went on a number of trips with his family, and he spoke. And he went to Australia. He went to, as I mentioned, South Africa and Kenya, New Zealand. He number of trips to the United States and Canada, and he spoke at large crowds in various places.
There's a wonderful movie, The Great Houdini from 1976, which displays that scene between Conan Doyle and Houdini. So if you're an old movie buff, you might have seen it.
Yeah.
One last question here. You mentioned about what Conan Doyle referred to as Mohammedanism, that is to say, Islam, and specifically in reference to the issue of use of alcohol. Did he have anything more to say about Islam?
Well, he writes about Muslim characters in some of his stories, and he gets it wrong. He has Sikhs with Muslim names, and I don't think he wrote occasionally he would make a reference, but he wasn't doing anything extensive.
Well, thank you very much, Cliff. I think those of us who have an Egyptian interest generally know that Egypt is a land of many fascinating facets. And of course, you've shown this evening how Arthur Conan Doyle is much more than just the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, but also a man of many, many facets. And particularly drawing those two things together of Egypt and Conan Doyle. And we're all very grateful to you this evening for showing us the wonderfully fascinating stories that are there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a notice to everybody that our next lecture is on Thursday, March the 7th. It will be online again, and I'm putting the information in the chat. March the 7th, Nadav Sharon from the University of Toronto speaking on the end of the Hasmonean dynasty and its effects on Judea and Judaism. We're having a little bit of difficulty with our website at the moment, so we can't actually add the Zoom link to our website right now. So if you'd like to receive that Zoom link for our next lecture, just put your email address in the chat and I will receive it. I don't think everybody else will. I think it's just me who will receive it, and I'll make sure that you get notice about our next meeting on Thursday, March the 7th. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight, and especially to the Society for the Study of Egyptian Antiquities for co-sponsoring this evening's lecture. Have a good evening.